Halloween is a strange time of year that often sparks a fascination with the darkest elements of our world and the people who carry out unimaginable acts. It's always been an incredibly creepy holiday for me, one I'd prefer to leave off the calendar. So when it came to making a new video for y'all this week, I got to thinking, why not cover the darkest memories from this evil day to remind us that the costumes and decorations are by no means the scariest things out there. Modern horror movies have idolized the murderer as a sort of anti-hero, but Scream has nothing on the acts that occurred on Halloween night 1977. Lawton is a quiet, medium-sized Midwestern town in southern Oklahoma, a picturesque location in many regards, but beneath the facade is an inner darkness that Halloween seems to activate. Parents George and Rose Carter awoke in the middle of the night to the startling fact that their 19-month-old daughter Nema was missing from her bed. Initially unalarmed, George would later recall thinking how amusing it was his daughter had managed to find another new hiding spot in their small home. That wasn't until a thorough search of the house revealed that Nema actually was gone. An investigation then took place, including volunteers and police officers, but nothing was found. The parents were utterly heartbroken, but things would only get worse when some local boys opened a refrigerator in an abandoned home and a baby's body fell out. Scared, the boys ran away, and shortly thereafter, a soldier also entered the home from the local Fort Still military installation and happened upon the scene. He reported the body to the local authorities, and it was quickly identified as none other than Nema Carter. Her parents' hearts forever had a hole in them because of this, but as it would turn out, they weren't the only parents to suffer such a loss. On April 8th of 1976, another act of pure evil occurred when two girls were uncovered in the refrigerator of an abandoned home situated by the railroad tracks. The girls were found 2 days after their kidnapping by another group of boys who, after hearing noises inside the home, mustered up the testicular fortitude to enter said home, where upon opening the fridge, they found two girls. The girls' names were Mary and Tina, and they had been left to die. And for Mary, this would be sadly true. She suffocated shortly after being shut in. However, Tina, through God's grace and pure strength, managed to survive, sucking in air through a tiny hole. Not only did she survive, but Tina actually managed to identify the assailant. Taking the stand at the age of 10, Tina testified that it was none other than their babysitter, 16-year-old Jacqueline Rubido, who had kidnapped them. Jacqueline had entered the girls' home and coaxed the girls outside in the middle of the day while they were watching TV inside their grandmother's home. At first, the girls were actually having fun because their babysitter had made a surprise visit, but quickly they became scared. Jacqueline took them from their home to the abandoned house and put them in the fridge, telling them that they had to get in and that their aunt was coming to get them and would take them out for ice cream afterwards. Now, in my mind and many others, this is enough to send Jacqueline to the chair, but it's only going to get worse from here. A neighbor had actually witnessed this entire event of Jacqueline dragging the two girls by their arms as they fought to get loose, but couldn't. The neighbor stated that the reason she didn't report what happened that day was simply because she didn't want to get involved. We call that the bystander effect, which is sadly all too common in these sorts of things. But since one of these stories happened on April 8th, what does that have anything to do with Halloween? Well, it has everything to do with it because these two situations are not separate occurrences, but are tied together. And it all becomes clear when I tell you that the babysitter of Nema, the baby who was abducted, was none other than Jacqueline, the same babysitter of the two girls placed in the fridge. This wasn't the only similarity though. In both cases, the suspect had managed to sneak in and out of the homes undetected and keep the children calm while doing so, implying that the kids knew who was abducting them. Even more frightening is that Nema's parents recall hearing Nema crying that Halloween night, but they were trying to get her to learn how to sleep on her own, so they let her cry it out. But her father George has lived to regret that day, asking himself if that night the intruder had been in Nema's room, perhaps hiding in the closet, and if so, could he have stopped it? This is a question we may never know the answer to because despite eyewitness testimonies, including from the child that was abducted, Jacqueline would never be arrested. Call it what you will, a fluke or a failure of the justice system, but this is one chick who deserved the long arm of the law. I think Cecil Davidson, the detective at the time, describes Jacqueline's behavior best on those days of her interrogation. Cecil says that during her questioning, Jacqueline was, and I quote, very quiet, never looked you in the eyes. Her eyes were always somewhere else or looking at the ground. She would always get right close to telling you something critical, and then she'd back off. Now, that sounds pretty incriminating to me, but the strangest thing David recalls from his questioning was a very odd response she had. Davidson said that she was very angry about the fact that everybody got to play bingo and she was going to get stuck babysitting. Now that just gives you the shivers, doesn't it? But despite David having no doubts it was Jacqueline, the DA never thought there was enough evidence to prosecute. Thus, Jacqueline got to live freely until she died of cancer. Before she died, though, Jacqueline was questioned by the cops on other occasions, where without confessing to the actual murder, She gave details that even the cops hadn't known, but even with that, nothing ever happened to her. My mom would always tell me to watch out for the weirdos on Halloween night because they really are everywhere. And in the case of Chime Weiss, which I'm definitely mispronouncing, this would ring tragically true. Halloween night 1986, Chime Weiss was asleep in his bed when he was brutally cleaved to death with some sort of hatchet or large knife. Chime was an Orthodox Jew studying at rabbinical school and the kind of kid you hope yours grows up to be. Kind, respectful, and well-liked, he didn't have enemies or hold grudges. He was a great young man. Unfortunately, I have to emphasize the was because his body was discovered by an RA when he failed to show up for Shabbat. Weiss's skull had been crushed and there were no signs of a struggle. Curious though, investigation showed that his body had been moved from the bed where the killing took place to the floor where it was found. The murder occurred on the 3rd floor of a dorm building, with a fire escape being the only other means of entry besides the door. However, there was no sign of forced entry anywhere and nothing had been stolen. The strangeness of this incident grew when officials of the school and investigators noticed a window had been left open, which in Orthodox Jewish customs is meant to allow for the soul to depart the space. Things would then take an even more bizarre turn when a Yazrit candle appeared in his room, which represents the dead and is lit in memory of them. Now, none of the investigators did it or school officials, so to this day, no one has any idea how the candle actually got there. Like all the other cases you and I are going to dive into this evening, Chime Weiss's murder would never be solved. Despite an attempt by his father to reinvigorate the case in 2013 and a large reward, nothing has come of it. On the morning of November the 1st, 1980, a 14-year-old girl was found dead, completely naked, lying face down by the side of the road. The only thing left on her body was a smoky brown or blue glass colored stone hanging from a thin gold chain around her neck. Even her earrings were missing, but whether this was done by the perpetrator or her is unknown. Additionally, there was a pair of red high heels found next to her, and that's about it. The investigation would reveal that a number of people had seen her on her final night, but the information seemed to only add to the mystery. One such individual was the attendant who saw her arrive at the South End Gulf Station at 6:30 p.m. Intriguingly, the witness noticed her step out of a blue Chevrolet Caprice with a light-toned top that had been driven by a Caucasian male. We have no idea who this guy is to this day. However, what most intrigued the investigators was not the man in the Caprice, but rather what she would ask the attendant for. Of all things, the girl asked for directions to the Texas Department of Corrections Ellis Prison Farm, and then after receiving them, she left on foot. A short while later, she would be spotted again at the Hitch and Post truck stop on Interstate 45. In this case though, the witness was a little bit more inquisitive about the girl's life. When the girl who asked the witness, who turns out was a waitress at the local restaurant, why she was going to this prison, she said that she had a friend there waiting for her. Weirded out, the waitress decided to be generous and drew her a map of exactly where she needed to go to get to this prison. While drawing the map, the waitress decided to ask the girl more about herself, convinced that she was a runaway. The girl revealed that she was from Aransas Pass, Texas, which for context was about 260 miles away from her current location. In addition to this, the girl claimed that she was 19 years old, which the waitress immediately called cap on and asked if her parents knew where she was. And all the girl replied with was, "Who cares?" And as far as we're aware, this waitress was one of, if not the last person to see this girl alive, since her body would be found just several hours later. Obviously, the first stop for police on the investigation after uncovering this information was the prison, so they brought with her a photo of the girl and a description and asked everyone at the prison if they knew the girl and showed them her picture, but neither the inmates or the guards knew who she was. But then again, if you knew a 14-year-old girl as a prisoner or a guard was coming to visit you and found out she had died, would you tell the truth? Which has left many to be very suspicious of this investigation as a whole. But since everyone at the prison told the police no, there really wasn't much to go on, and despite their best efforts, investigators came and went on this case, and it would remain unsolved for over 40 years until 2021 when the girl's identity was uncovered utilizing DNA records, which provided this Jane Doe with a name, that being Sherry Ann Jarvis. And as the waitress had guessed, Sherry was a runaway, and she was not 19, she was actually 14. There isn't a ton of details on Sherry's life story, but we have some. After missing classes and causing disturbances, her parents sent her to a home to help reform juveniles who were misbehaving. Now, unlike many of these places, this actually wasn't a bad one. She was surrounded by other girls her age, and by all accounts, this was a stand-up operation, but Sherry, being a rebellious kid, just wanted out of it. So based on an account of her friend at the time, when the opportunity presented itself, this is what we believe happened. Supposedly, Sherry had been friends with two girls from the same area at that time who had a car and ended up heading up to Green Bay. Afterwards, these two girls had decided to come back from their trip, but Sherry took the chance and told them she wasn't going home, and instead bolted. Outside of this and the eyewitness reports, we know that Sherry sent one letter to her mother in August of 1980 saying, quote, "You won't hear from me until I'm at least 18 or 21. Both of her parents would die before her identity was uncovered," meaning they never knew what happened to their daughter. And even more sadly, throughout his entire life and even through his final days, her father had never given up hope that she would call, and for 38 years, he kept the exact same phone number. Stepping to our next case for this evening, I have a question. When you think of Halloween, what comes to mind? Pumpkins, candy, costumes, trick-or-treating? Well, in the case of Marvin Brandland, Halloween night took a disturbing turn when a late-night visitor approached his door. On October 31st, 1982, in Fort Dodge, Iowa, Marvin opened his door to a grown man wearing a pillowcase over his head with the eyes cut out. All this man said was, "Trick or treat, give me your money or I'll shoot." Thinking this was a joke, Marvin's wife Ethel tried taking the pillowcase off of the dude's face, totally thinking this was a friend or a family member, but he held it down and then followed Ethel inside. Inside, he drew his gun and demanded to be taken to the family's basement safe. This was a key detail for the family in the aftermath because only a small group of family and friends knew that they even had a safe, and for any unaware thief, the couple would have been an unlikely target considering their lack of capital. But Marvin's had other plans for this man. Being a veteran of the Second World War, he had encountered much more frightening things in his life. So he grabbed for the gun, believing this to be some sort of prank still, but in doing so, was shot in the throat, injuries which he would later succumb to in the hospital. Seemingly frightened, the killer sprinted out the door, leaving his mask behind, and to this day, that is all we have of the killer. You know, that and the fact that the family is absolutely certain they know who committed this crime because he later bragged about it to them. But once again, these pesky DAs didn't think there was enough evidence, so the murderer went free. But what about the mask, you ask? Well, it was tested a number of years back and it was uncovered that there simply wasn't enough genetic material to pull from. However, what I've learned from making these videos is that every year technology is evolving in the DNA world, meaning at some point they may be capable of sending this fellow to Old Sparky. Although it's been about 40 years, it's better late than never. The story took another tragic turn when a few months after the loss of their grandfather, the family would suffer another heartbreak when on Thanksgiving Day, Marvin's wife Ethel simply broke down and couldn't stop crying. And just a few months after this, she too passed away, dying from heartbreak. But don't worry you guys, it's not all frowns around here, because on Halloween night 2002, Minneapolis was struck by their own addition to the smiley face murders. Chris Jenkins was a young man who was simply too good of a target for this perpetrator to pass up. At the age of 21, Chris was a business student at the University of Minnesota, captain of the lacrosse team, and loved by everyone who knew him. On Halloween night, he had dressed up as an American Indian and had gone with his girlfriend and a group to the Lone Tree Bar and Grill in Minneapolis. Things took an odd turn though when he was kicked out around midnight. To this day, we don't know exactly what for, but we do know that he had been in the midst of a pretty serious argument with his girlfriend. Leaving the bar that night, he left his phone, wallet, and jacket. However, the jacket would be the least of Chris's problems because that night, the last person to see Chris alive was the bouncer who watched him leave and walk down the street. For 4 months, Chris's family was in agony as their son was a missing person and the chances of him being found alive decreased with every moment. And then 4 months after his disappearance, Chris's family got the absolute worst news they could have. His body had been found in the river between 2 logs, still wearing his Halloween costume. Oddly enough, the police would label this as an accident/suicide basically immediately, and for years the case would sit like this. However, Chris's parents weren't going to have any of this, so they hired a private investigator who uncovered some discrepancies with the police's theory. According to a number of sources, the toxicology report indicated that not only was Chris's blood alcohol content well above the legal limit, it is also rumored that GHB was found in his system. GHB is a potent date rape drug, and even for a well-tuned athlete like Chris, it will definitely take its effect and make him much more malleable. In addition to this, GHB had just several months prior been used on a young man at the exact same bar who was captured by a group of men who then tried to drag him into the back of a van, but were stopped by this young man's friend who is the only reason he is still alive today. But it would seem that the police didn't even take this account into consideration. In addition to this odd connection, Chris's case had become nefarious for a number of reasons. The first is that over the years, a number of people have actually confessed to killing him or being part of the murder. However, these must be taken with a grain of salt, because most of these men were in prison or couldn't have been there at the time. Additionally, police have been actively investigating the case with supposed new evidence. However, what this new evidence is unknown to the public. Finally, though, we can assume that Chris didn't commit suicide suicide or fall into the water by accident because he was found in the exact same state he had last been seen in, with his slip-on shoes on, shirt tucked in, and arms crossed. All things that wouldn't be the case had he fallen over the railing by accident or intentionally, where his body would have been flailing about and things like slip-on shoes would have fallen off. All of this evidence and the prior circumstances of GHB being used at this bar culminated in the police shifting their cause of death from suicide to homicide in November of 2006. Interestingly, these findings are in line with what Chris's parents and the PI believe happened, which is that he was attacked, abducted, and then driven around for some time in a van before his body was dumped in the water. This theory makes even more sense considering the GHB that was rumored to be in Chris's system and the previous encounter another man had with a group of people at the exact same bar. But if you recall when I introduced this story, I referenced the smiley face murders, which, if you don't know, are a series of killings framed to look like drownings of young men matching Chris's description, that being young Caucasian men who were well liked and had a bright future. And this is what really seals the deal here. Over the years, more than 40 deaths have been attributed to the smiley face killer, as at every single scene, graffiti of a smiley face was found by investigators, and Chris's case is actually one of these. Although many investigators are reluctant to believe in such a serial killer being on the loose, time is proving that this is very likely the case. We're gonna do a cooldown lap here and take pauses from the murders for a good old Halloween mystery. Well, not a good old one, but definitely quite the mystery. The case of Stephen DeMann is one that really makes you think. Like all of our stories, on October 31st, the event in question would take place. It's 1955 in East Meadow, New York, and Marilyn DeMann was headed into the bakery with her children to get some fresh bread. Like many women of that time, she parked her stroller outside the bakery with Pamela, who was 7 months old at the time, and Stephen, who was 2, waiting inside the stroller outside the store. While only gone for a few minutes, there was not a single moment she thought something could go wrong, because this was absolutely normal what she was doing. In fact, there were even other strollers parked outside the bakery that very same day. However, after paying for her bread, she would walk outside and find that the stroller was missing. Shortly thereafter, she would find it a few blocks away with Pamela safely inside, but Stephen completely gone. Marilyn then went into shock and had to be rushed to the hospital, and during her hiatus, there was an intensive investigation occurring that combed everywhere for the missing child. Over 2,000 volunteers partook, but they found absolutely diddly squat. When Marilyn's husband Jeffrey returned home, who was an airman at the time, the two went on national television begging for information, saying that Stephen was a mama's boy who never wandered and that there were medicines he needed, but no one had any information. The only information that the two would ever receive were a set of 3 ransom notes, the first one being for $3,000, the next for $10,000, and the final for $14,000. But police would uncover that it was a college student trying to extort the couple. And even worse, he had no information about the case. To this very day, there has never been any more information about Stephen, although authorities are very certain that he wasn't killed that day, but instead adopted into a family that then pretended he was their own. For over 50 years after the disappearance, there would be no new information. However, in the early 2000s, the feds would distribute computer-generated images of what they believed Stephen would look like today. And shockingly, a man actually came forward. The man's name was John Barnes, and based on his family history, he truly believed he was Stephen DeMann. However, after the feds got involved and did some DNA testing, it was proven that he was in fact not Stephen, leaving us with the same number of answers that we had in 1955. 0. To this day, the case of Stephen DeMann is an open one, so if any of my 0.7% of viewers who are in the right age range think you look like this gentleman right here, reach out to the FBI and definitely write a comment below. Hyung Song was a South Korean girl who moved to America to attend Penn State. By all accounts, she was well liked, had a great relationship with her family and friends, and was generally a studious individual. However, on the night of October the 31st, 2001, everything would change for her and those who knew her, because the very wee hours of the morning of November 1st would prove to be her final as far as we know. That evening, Song, dressed as a bunny, attended a costume party with a number of friends, where she would stay until roughly 2 a.m. Then, following the party, she joined several other friends who headed to one of their apartments to play video games until 4 a.m. when Song was dropped off by a friend at her apartment in a 300 block of West Clinton Avenue. Unknowingly, this friend was the last to see Song alive. Unlike many of the other disappearances we've discussed this evening, we have a general idea of what likely happened next. Based on the evidence found at Song's apartment, we know that after being dropped off, she went inside because friends and investigators found her costume eyelashes inside, along with her cell phone, which had been turned off. Nothing else would be found missing from her apartment except for her keys and her purse, which contained her credit cards and driver's license. Based on this, it's a common belief that Song then headed to a local 24-hour mart where she frequently visited. But at some point on this journey, everything went awry. What we do know though is that said it's extremely doubtful Song disappeared of her own volition. Her behavior was normal that night, she wasn't under any undue stress, and seemed to be really enjoying life. When Song didn't appear for several days, her friends were relatively unalarmed, meaning that she wasn't reported missing until 3 whole days after she went missing. Yep, you heard me right. For 3 days, no one reported Song as missing, meaning that the perpetrator had 3 days to get a head start on the feds. Which is why this strange eyewitness report has even more credence in my opinion. Our witness states that she saw a woman matching Song's description inside a vehicle with an unidentified male in Chinatown. The witness states that Song called for help, so she approached the car and asked if everything was alright, only to be interrupted by the man who yelled at the witness to leave. Philadelphia, where Song was supposedly reported as having been seen, is about a 200-mile drive from Penn State, but considering this dude had 3 days, it's entirely possible that she actually was there. But police seem to disagree with me, since this tip would never quite get the investigation it deserved, because the tipster's story had a little too much fluctuation in their opinion. What happened to Song is left up in the air. I personally believe that she was trafficked, which would explain the Chinatown encounter, but that's not the only theory. In fact, there is a known and convicted murderer who actually admitted to involvement in her death. Hugo Marcus Selensky is a character in and of himself, a bank robber who, after being arrested, was found with upwards of 12 different sets of human remains in his backyard. Hugo's story that night is pretty convincing. He says that, along with his comrade Michael Jason Kurkowski Jr., they abducted Song with the intention of killing her because they thought she was a hooker. It seems fairly certain that they found out later she wasn't a hooker, and yet still killed her, and Hugo tells us that their means of doing so was to imprison her in a walk-in safe in his home until she died, where he then buried the body in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania. And if that wasn't dark enough, Kurkowski kept her bunny ears as a souvenir. The real kicker though is that no one can actually confirm this story, because Kurkowski, Hugo's partner, is actually one of the bodies buried in Hugo's backyard. And since Song's body has yet to be found, all we have to go on is Hugo's confession, and all of his friends who stated that Hugo used to brag about her, which evidently isn't enough these days because no one has been sentenced in the Song case, and to this day it remains unsolved. This next mystery may be our last, but it is nonetheless incredibly dark. It's Halloween night 1982, and a 13-year-old girl named Christy Lynn Vorak is walking the streets of Tacoma when, well, we don't actually know what happened. There are reports of her at a bus stop, but this was never confirmed, so it is truly as though she vanished from the face of the earth. We do know, however, that in all likelihood, she was one of the 71 victims of a man named Gary Ridgeway. Yes, you heard me correctly, 71 victims. But as of today, only 48 of them have been confirmed, 2 of which remain Jane Does to this very day. The reason we believe Christy is among these victims is because Gary had a penchant for killing hookers, whom he went on the record as saying that he hated. And unfortunately for Christy that night, she happened to be in one of his prime locations, and although not a hooker, she was walking around an area where she would have been mistaken for one, and it is believed that Gary had been her killer, and in 1993 it was officially stated that he was so. Strangely though, Gary would never confirm his involvement, despite taking pride in his work, claiming that it was his career. Additionally, everyone who knew Gary claimed he was very family oriented, which is why his actions came as even more of a shock when people found out, because outside of a little bit of strange behavior and seeming slightly off, he was supposedly a nice guy. In this case though, of all these, there can be no doubt, because upon raiding Gary's house, the feds found an envelope filled with all sorts of trophies that Gary had taken from his victims. However, it is still unclear that whether or not anything that belonged to Christy was among these trophies of his. After his arrest, Gary was teed up and the prosecution battled to have him sent to the chamber. However, a deal was made which involved him pleading guilty to 48 murder charges in return for commutation, in which he only received life imprisonment. After the sentencing was handed down, Gary received a whopping 48 life sentences, 1 for each murder. And since he tampered with evidence at each of the 48 crime scenes, he received an extra 10 years per murder, meaning that if he could somehow serve 48 life sentences, he would then have to serve another 480 years in prison. So it's safe to say he won't be getting out anytime soon, but this isn't justice, especially for Christy's family, who to this day have no idea what actually happened to their daughter. So I suppose that after watching a video like this, it would be easy to assume that Halloween drags out the darkness in people, but I don't think that's quite true. The only thing Halloween does is glorify such actions, like Scream, which we talked about so long ago. Evil people are always evil. Halloween is just a day where we all pretend to be as well. So tonight, when you go out trick-or-treating or hang out with friends, just remember that there's a long history of evil on the 31st, and that the person at your door may not be pretending, or the car following you to the store may not just be passing by. Evil is not the exception, it's the rule. So in many ways, Halloween is happening every day of the year, we just don't dress up. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and we shall return to regular broadcasting next week. Until next time, thank you all for watching, and I can't wait to see, hopefully all of you, in the next one.